Welcome to Change the Climate, a show about the Olympia chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby and changing the political climate for a livable world. I'm your host, Ari Simmons. Today we'll be talking to Charlie Stevens, a local climate activist and shellfish farmer. Today he'll be talking about the impacts of climate change on shellfish and the shellfish industry. Here with Charlie Stevens, a co-owner of Camilchi Farms, and amazing climate activist here in Thurston County. Hi, Charlie.
Hello, Ari.
How are you?
I'm good.
Good. So I'm going to ask a really simple question. What does Camilchi mean?
Well, I don't know exactly, but I think it is the local place name. We're here on the edge of Totten Inlet, and farther up the bay is the area they call Camilchi, which I believe in the local tribal language means something like Big Valley or Beautiful Valley. Anyway, it's the place name for this whole area of Mason County.
Awesome. And it's a sea farm?
We are a shellfish farm. Yeah, we raise mussels and oysters.
Wow. For consumption?
Yep, for human consumption.
That's great. And so I would imagine that climate change in particular has profound impacts on your business.
It does, even today, and certainly in the future. It's going to be more and more so.
Wow. And what are those impacts in particular?
Well, right now, what we've noticed so far, I don't know, maybe the last 10 or 12 years, is the weather patterns are much less predictable than they were years ago. We've been at this since 1981, which is not a long time compared to many shellfish companies here, and they could probably tell you about even more changes that they've seen. But in the last 10 or 12 years, the weather patterns have been very unpredictable. And we're a farm, right? So just like any farm, whether you're raising chickens or soy or Christmas trees or shellfish, unpredictability is abhorrent to us. So when the weather is unpredictable, it really throws a kink into what we're doing. And for us, the thing I think I've seen, the most salient feature is that it's just windier now than it was in the old days, in the quote-unquote old days. There's just more days, a higher percentage of days when we have wind. And researchers have told us that with climate change, there's just more energy in the atmospheric system. And for us, apparently, that takes the form of more wind.
And what are exactly the ideal conditions for growing mussels and oysters?
Ideal conditions are what we have here in Totten Inlet in South Puget Sound, which is just the perfect mix of saltwater and freshwater, tidal inflows, sunshine, all of that. South Puget Sound is a tremendous engine for growing shellfish, clams, oysters, mussels. But it's a very delicate mix, so any kind of a knock or bump really kind of puts us on edge. We're totally at the mercy of Mother Nature. And when the ocean and weather and climate are out of sync or out of kilter, it's for the worse for us.
And does your business particularly service the Thurston County, Washington State kind of area, or do you ship like internationally or nationally?
Well, about 80% of our product, and it's mostly mussels that we're growing these days, about 80% of it stays within the state, but we also send mussels to Hawaii, California, and a little bit farther afield also. And actually to Oregon. Quite a bit of our product goes to Oregon. So we're mostly a regional company.
Awesome. And would you say that one of the reasons why you are so participatory in local climate action is because of concerns around your business model, or are there other reasons why you really care deeply about the issue of climate?
Well, yeah, I think all citizens, no matter what line of business, quote unquote, they're in, ought to be concerned about the future. But for us, it's really kind of, it's our bread and butter. If we don't have a stable climate to depend on, we don't have much of a future. So just to give you an idea of some of the things that other growers have experienced in the Northwest as far as what to worry about with climate change. I mentioned the unpredictability of the weather, more frequent storms, and more devastating storms also. Sea level rise, we talked about that earlier, and that's definitely going to be a big one for us because it puts at risk a lot of our gear. It makes it difficult to be working on the beach for folks who have beachfront to work. And in the long run, ocean acidification is really the big one. That's the big thing that's going to knock us out if we're not careful.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And can you briefly explain for our viewers that don't know what ocean acidification is, an overview of what it is and how it affects shellfish?
Yes. I'll try to make it brief because it's really a complex thing, as you might guess. It's all about chemistry. So shellfish are calcifiers. Whether it's a clam, mussel, oyster, lobster, or even coral, they take calcium carbonate from the seawater. They depend on that for building their shells. So with ocean acidification, as we know, the atmosphere is being inundated with more and more greenhouse gases. CO2 is the big one for us. About a quarter of that CO2 that goes up in the air, and it's human-caused, as we know, about a quarter of that has been absorbed by the oceans over time. And we used to think that that was a good thing, because if the ocean wasn't acting as a shock absorber or a sink for all of that excess CO2, our atmosphere would be in even greater danger. We'd have even lower pH in the atmosphere and higher parts per million levels of greenhouse gases. But that's only true to a certain point, and what it's been discovered lately is that the ocean can only absorb so much. So over the last 250 years or so, the ocean has absorbed something like, did I say 250 years?
Yes.
Yeah, 250 years. The ocean has absorbed over 500 billion tons of CO2. And the result is the oceans today are about 30% more acidic than they were at the beginning of the industrial age. So what happens when the ocean acidifies, it's never going to become totally acidic, but more acidic than it is now, is that carbon dioxide gets absorbed by the water, creates a weak carbonic acid, and what happens then is that in those waters, the carbonate ions that shellfish depend on for building their shell are actually bound up. They're soaked up by excess hydrogen ions in acidified waters. So the carbonate is just unavailable, or it's very scarce for an oyster, for example, to use. And this is especially troublesome for us growers when the shellfish are in their very early stage, like the larval stage or the juvenile stage. When a planktonic animal like oyster larvae is just drifting in the water and then it's ready to settle down and form its shell, that's when it's most vulnerable. And that's when they can't get the carbonate out of the seawater to build their shell. Or if they do, it costs them so much energy that that animal soon dies before it even develops very far. So in the Northwest here, we're especially vulnerable to this ocean acidification because of the geomorphology of our coastline. us growers depend very heavily on hatcheries to produce what we call seed or young shellfish to keep our farms replenished. Oysters especially, for example. And what happens is the hatcheries are located on the outer coast of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia. And in the summertime, which is the big time that the hatcheries are running, the prevailing winds are from the north. And what that means is that with the spinning of the earth, the Coriolis effect, and that north wind, it sends the surface waters offshore, and those surface waters are replaced by deep water coming up near the coastline. That's called upwelling. And in many ways, that's a good thing because the upwelled water is rich in nutrients. So areas of the coast, like the coast of Peru or South America, where there's heavy seasonal upwelling, are fantastic places for plant and animal life because of the nutrified water. But it just so happens here in the eastern North Pacific, that upwelled water is also acidified water. So the hatcheries, before they discovered ways to deal with it, were drawing in that acidified water in the summertime, and within 2 days, the oyster larvae were dying in the hatchery before they figured out ways around that. And they have figured out ways now to work around that, but it's a continuing problem. Just because the ocean waters are acidified to a certain point now, that's not a static situation. As humans just continue to pump more and more CO2 into the atmosphere, our waters are just going to get more acidified. So it was a pretty touch and go time there about 8 or 9 years ago. There was a period of time from 2005 to 2009 when the production of the hatcheries dropped by about 80%. And so shellfish growers didn't have that source of seed. We can't continue our businesses on that basis. So we know that we're kind of living on that knife edge right now.
So what I'm noticing is that a lot of shellfish owners are kind of coming out of their shell and really taking action to ensure that their businesses and that these wonderful creatures not only find their way to our dishes, but also kind of find their way to our hearts. And that is a really important thing. And what you're pretty much noting is the fundamental need for our country and for our world to begin to transition to clean energy economies.
That's
where
right.
We're no longer putting CO2 out into the world, but we're harnessing the power of the sun and the wind. Like you said, Puget Sound is windier, which is a very astute observation. Mm-hmm. And really just begin to focus on how we can protect our water by changing our energy systems.
Right.
And you were very active with 1631, canvassing and doorbelling. What were some of your experiences as someone who's really intrinsically tied to this issue?
Boy, the experiences I had just going door to door, they ran the whole gamut. Some people were very concerned and very supportive of the initiative and would claim that they were going to tell their friends and get everybody in their family to vote. Other people, surprisingly, had very little interest or knowledge about what was going on. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to raise people's awareness. Personally, if I could make a personal observation, it was pretty distressing to see how easy it was, if it was easy, I think it was, for $31 million to sway many people to vote a certain way when all of our futures are at risk. I'm speaking of the fossil fuel companies that contributed heavily to the No on 1631 campaign.
Mm-hmm. Using very strong messaging around tax increases and increased costs for gas and other things like that. And we know you and I both know that the cost of not acting and not transitioning to these systems far outweigh any minute increase in our cost of living, which is not decreasing either.
That's right. And to put it in just stark economic terms, our industry, shellfish, aquaculture in the state of Washington, is a $270 million a year industry that's now at risk, and it supports over 3,000 jobs directly and indirectly in Washington state. Not only that, it's especially important economically in these rural areas like we have here in Mason County and Pacific County in the Willapa Bay. For example, in Willapa Bay in Pacific County, where the Willapa is located, aquaculture and processing of shellfish is a $100 million a year industry to that small county. And they produce actually about 25% of the oysters that are harvested and sold in the United States. So, I mean, if we're talking just pure dollars and cents, that's a huge industry that is at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we have a lot of work to do. There are some really progressive climate policies being proposed in the legislature, despite the loss of 1631, like 100% clean.
Right.
Have you heard of 100% clean?
Yeah, I'm just starting to learn about what's being proposed.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which would essentially ensure that we are carbon neutral by 2045, very similar to policies that have been proposed in the state of California, and off of coal by 2025, which is a great thing to lobby for as well, and I'm sure we'll be looking for your local leadership and story as we progress forward with that.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the Citizens Climate Lobby policy. Right. And so, we have a lot of very interesting policies still being proposed because we know that this issue, despite this loss, is not going away.
Right.
And do you have any sort of aspirations or things that you would want to participate in moving forward in terms of climate activism?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, you used the word story. I'm part of a group called the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition, which is a nationwide banding together of several commercial growers like ourselves from the Pacific Coast, the Atlantic Coast, and the Gulf of Mexico, all three. And we're convened by the Nature Conservancy. And our purpose is to get across our story about how climate change is affecting us. Actually, on the East Coast, things are in some ways even worse than here on the Pacific Coast. To get our story across to our customers, retailers, restaurant goers, the general public, and to also try to influence policy makers about the need to rein in our addiction to fossil fuels and to pursue a clean energy future. So that I'm looking forward to being more involved with that. I think that's a great thing.
That's
because
wonderful.
Story is what it's all about, right? As you said earlier, everybody has a story, and those are the most powerful ways to talk to our neighbors.
Of course, and this coalition that's formed, are you looking to do videos, or are you writing a...
Well, I know that just like with the Citizens Climate Lobby, we're hoping to get together once or twice a year in Washington, D.C. to descend upon Congress and talk to our individual Congress people. Beyond that, I don't know what specific legislation they're pushing, but it's just gotten off the ground. I think it's only been going for about 2 or 3 months now.
Yes, and I'm seeing that the Trump administration is greatly reducing the EPA's ability to protect our water, allowing for toxic pollutions to be introduced into our waterways and things of that nature. What are some of your concerns moving forward for your industry and protecting our sea life and our seafood? And how do you see sort of this shellfish business evolving over time?
along with climate change per se, I'm very concerned about what's been going on for a few decades now in the Northwest, which is increased runoff. So we know that climate change here in our region is most likely going to result in increased seasonal rainfalls, right? Well, we're already dealing with polluted runoff from not what they call non-point sources from the landscape. And so that's just going to be exacerbated now with increased rainfalls. And actually, our industry is regulated on the basis of the bacteria that show up in the growing waters that are a direct result of what's washing in from the uplands, as we call them. So that's just going to get worse and worse. We've lost a lot of certified grounds in Washington State over the last 30, 35 years, and I fear that that's just going to get worse and worse.
Wow. Well, I mean, the whole experience of eating oysters is definitely a magical one, and one that I know people here in the Northwest and all over the country really value. Particularly, I'm from the New York City metropolitan region, and New York City was a really prominent grower of oysters.
Oh, Long Island Sound was huge.
Yes,
yeah.
And I know that that is a very special tradition on the East Coast and in New York City, and here as well. Olympia has some incredible sea life. I know that looking for oysters and gooey duck and all of that are really time-honored traditions here, and not only that, but our native indigenous communities here also depend on the health and quality of the sound for their livelihoods, not only for shellfish, but also for Chinook and other really incredible sea life.
That's right, it all fits together.
It does. And I just want to thank you for sharing your story and bringing the topic of shellfish to us here in our community and to our viewers. I definitely think it's something that's almost taken for granted when we receive food
That's right.
on our plate, whether it be grown on farms in California or coming from other places. We don't really think about how the climate is impacting our food until it's no longer available to us.
That's right.
And until we're no longer able to order these things and have these be part of our traditions and our culture.
And by then, it's too late. I mean, we have to act now. For example, I don't know how much more time we have, but for example, I described the upwelling that's going on the coast. Well, the waters that upwelled, this is an example to show how urgent the situation is. The waters that upwelled off the coast this past summer, those deep waters were last in contact with the atmosphere around 1970, about 40 or 45 years ago. And so they absorbed the CO2 levels that were in the atmosphere at that time, which were much lower than they are now. So I'm making the point that there's a huge lag time here. So in the future years, every summer, those upwelled waters are just going to get more and more acidified and causing more and more trouble until humans really tackle the problem. So
of course,
that's just a note about the urgency of doing something right away.
Of course, and climate definitely impacts the oscillation cycles of the ocean and is completely reconfiguring how our oceans actually flow. And there's a lot of uncertainty about how often you will receive these upwells, how cold or warm the water will be, what kinds of pollutants or toxins will be in the water, sea level rise, microbes that are now being released from ice that has been trapping a lot of unfavorable prehistoric diseases and other things like that. And not to scare our viewers, but these are all very real concerns that I'm sure that you have. And my biggest concern, and this is just a personal thing, is that the quality of our seafood is greatly diminishing, and it will be a question of whether or not it will be safe to eat in the future.
Yeah, safe to eat, and also whether there's going to be an adequate supply. I mean, I think I read this recently, that researchers figure that over the next 50 years, because of climate change directly, our fisheries catch and what we're culturing is going to drop by about 25%, just due to climate change effects. So that's pretty sobering, really. Mm-hmm. That's maybe not a good note to end on.
No.
We should end on a more positive note.
There are tremendous acts and movements that are currently in place, especially coming from the ground up.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's our stories, our narratives, and our sense of purpose around climate that's really going to provide context for what our future will be, which is hopefully one that is inclusive, one where we will have clean energy and feel morally and consciously in tune with the planet and how the planet has provided us with so much life and love already and so much beauty. And there's so much left to explore, so much more to learn about the creatures in our seas and how they truly impact our bodies and our minds and our culture.
That's right, and all of that is definitely within our grasp.
Absolutely. We can have this tomorrow if we all decide that this is the future that we want. And I look forward to working with you to making sure it's the future that we secure.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Ari.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah.
This is an update on the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. Energy Innovation and the Carbon Dividend Act is a bipartisan policy that will reduce America's carbon emissions by 40% in the first 12 years and create 2.1 million jobs. The policy is also revenue neutral, so the funds collected will be given back to Americans to spend any way they choose. Response from Citizens Climate Lobby volunteers and supporters has been incredible, with over 600 letters to the editor published. With all of this attention and prioritization, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act has been reintroduced into the U.S. House of Representatives. We are asking all Citizens Climate Lobby members to post on social media and write letters to congressional reps stating why the EICDA is important to you. To learn more, visit energyinnovationact.org or citizensclimatelobby.org. If you would like to know more about Citizens Climate Lobby, visit citizensclimatelobby.org or join us for our monthly meetings every second Saturday at 9:30 a.m. at the Olympia Center. Thanks for joining us on Change the Climate.